He sent me an email at 4 in the morning. No subject line, just a photograph of a corridor and a timestamp. He said he'd been watching the same hallway for 11 years, and that something in it had started watching him back. This story came from a night security guard in a commercial tower in Kowloon. He asked me not to use his real name. I've called him Vincent. Everything else, the basement footage, the figure that walked through walls, the sealed room behind the concrete that no one had opened since 1945, is exactly as he described it to me. The building had a particular kind of quiet at 2 in the morning. Not peaceful, just empty in a way that had weight to it. Vincent Lam had learned to stop noticing it years ago. That was the job. You learned to stop noticing things that didn't matter, and you learned to keep noticing the things that did. After 11 years on the night shift at Hoi Fong Commercial Tower, he had it sorted. He knew which elevator made a clicking sound on the way down. He knew which door on the 14th floor never fully latched. He knew the building the way you know a person you have spent a long time alone with. Not deeply, but completely, in the way of small details and reliable habits. He was 53 years old. He had worked this shift since his wife left and his daughter started secondary school. And he needed something that paid steadily and asked nothing of him during daylight hours. The hours suited him. The silence suited him. Most people thought that sounded sad. Vincent didn't think about it much either way. The monitoring station was on the ground floor, just off the main lobby. A desk, a chair, with a cracked armrest he had never gotten around to reporting, and 6 screens arranged in a shallow arc in front of him. Each one cycled through 3 camera feeds at 10-second intervals. 18 cameras total. He knew every angle of every one of them, knew which camera had a smudge in the lower left corner from a cleaning incident 4 years ago, knew which one had a slight lag that made people's movements look half a second behind their actual position. It was an ordinary Tuesday in February, cold outside. The kind of cold that came off the harbor and pressed against the glass of the lobby doors without getting in. Vincent had his thermos on the desk, jasmine tea, 2 bags, slightly too hot to drink comfortably, and his logbook open to a fresh page. He wrote the date, the time, the weather conditions. He wrote them in the same neat block characters he always used. He drew the line under the header the same way he always did. The screen cycled: lobby, stairwell, A, stairwell, B, 3rd floor corridor, 6th floor corridor, basement car park. He reached for his tea. The basement car park at Hoi Fong was not technically a car park anymore. It had been converted sometime in the early 2000s into a service corridor. Fluorescent strip lighting, exposed pipes along the ceiling, a row of metal shelving units along one wall holding cleaning supplies and spare parts. The camera was mounted high in the corner, angled down at roughly 45 degrees, covering the length of the main passage from the service lift at one end to a blank concrete wall at the other. There were no side doors, no windows, one way in, one way out. Screen 4 was the one with the smudge in the lower left corner. The timestamp in the upper right read 2:41. The corridor was empty. The fluorescent lights hummed the same way they always hummed. Slightly uneven, the second tube from the left, a fraction dimmer than the rest. The shelving unit cast the same long shadow across the same section of floor. Everything was exactly as it should be. Vincent was writing something in his logbook, a note about the 6th floor motion sensor, that had been triggering false alerts. When he looked up at the screens on the next cycle, he put down his pen. At the far end of the basement corridor, maybe 3 meters from the blank concrete wall, there was a figure. It was walking toward the camera. Not quickly. A steady, unhurried pace, like someone moving through a place they knew well. It wore dark clothing, a jacket of some kind, dark trousers. The image quality was not high enough to see a face clearly, but the figure was clearly a person, clearly upright, clearly walking. Vincent watched the screen for 4 full seconds before his brain produced the correct question. The corridor had one entrance, the service lift. The lift had not opened. He would have heard it from here, and screen 4 would have shown the doors parting. The camera covered the full length of the passage. There were no side passages, no alcoves, no rooms off the main corridor. The figure was 3 meters from the far wall. It had not come through the lift. It had not come through the wall. It had simply appeared mid-stride in the middle of the corridor, as if it had always been there, and the camera had only just caught up. Vincent stood up from his chair. He stood there for a moment, with his hand resting on the desk, watching the figure walk. It moved steadily, unhurried, covering the distance toward the camera at the same even pace. Its shadow fell cleanly behind it, under the fluorescent lights. That detail struck him for some reason he couldn't name. The shadow was right. It fell in the correct direction. It moved with the figure the way a shadow should. He sat back down. He reached for the playback controls without looking away from the screen, his fingers finding the rewind dial the way they always did, automatically, without thought. He dialed back to 239. The corridor was empty. He ran it forward. Empty, empty, empty. 241, second 14 of the cycle. The figure was there. No transition, no flicker. Between one frame and the next, present where nothing had been. Vincent sat very still in his chair with a cracked armrest and looked at the screen. His tea had gone cold enough to drink now, but he didn't reach for it. Outside, the harbor wind pressed against the lobby glass and found no way in. The building held its particular 2 in the morning quiet all around him. He rewound the tape again. He did not sleep when he got home. He sat at his kitchen table with his coat still on and watched the light change outside the window, from black to gray to the flat, tired white of a Hong Kong winter morning. On the table in front of him was a USB drive. He had copied the basement footage before his shift ended, all of it, from midnight through to 6, and he had done it quietly, before the day staff arrived, before anyone could ask what he was doing. He was not sure why he felt the need to be quiet about it. He only knew that he did. He sat there for a long time, without plugging it in. At 8:30, he made instant noodles he didn't eat. At 9, he plugged the drive into his laptop and opened the file. He set it to play at normal speed, and he watched the full 6 hours. This was the methodical part of him, the part that did not allow shortcuts. If there was an explanation for what he had seen, it would show itself through the full record. Not through a highlight, not through a clip, through the complete, unedited thing. The figure first appeared at 2:41, as he had seen it the night before. It walked. It walked at the same unhurried pace for the entire length of the corridor, and then, when it should have reached the far wall and turned back, or stopped, or done anything a person in a corridor would reasonably do, it simply kept walking, as if the wall were not there. And then at 2:44, it was gone, having passed directly through the concrete at the corridor's end without the camera recording any gap, any hesitation, any moment of transition. Vincent paused the footage. He went back, watched it again, then a third time, slower. What he had told himself the night before, that it had appeared from nowhere, he now had to revise. It had also disappeared into nowhere. Whatever had produced the figure had deposited it in the corridor at 2:41 and retrieved it at 2:44. 3 minutes of walking, purposeful, steady, and apparently unbothered by solid concrete. He let the recording continue. At 2:47, the figure was back. It came from the same end of the corridor, the wall end, the end with no door, and it walked the same direction at the same pace. Vincent watched it reach the far end of the frame, where the service lift sat with its doors closed, and then the figure turned, not sharply, a slow, deliberate turn, the kind a person makes when they know a space well and are not in a hurry to leave it, and it walked back the way it had come. This continued for 47 minutes, back and forth, always the same pace, always the same path, always appearing from the wall end and disappearing into it at the turn, then reappearing a few minutes later. Vincent counted the passes, 11 of them in total, each one identical to the last. He began to feel something he recognized from long drives on familiar roads. The specific dullness of watching something repeat until it stops feeling strange and starts feeling simply, terribly normal. He resisted that feeling. He forced himself to keep watching carefully. He pulled up the other camera feeds on the same timeline. The building had 3 cameras in the stairwells, 1 covering each lift bank, 2 in the lobby, and several along the upper corridors. He ran them all simultaneously, checking each intersection, each possible exit from the basement level. Nothing. The stairwell doors did not open. The lifts did not move. The lobby was empty. Whatever was in the basement corridor had no presence anywhere else in the building during those 47 minutes. It existed only on screen 4, only in that corridor, only in that walk. At 3:28, it stopped, mid-stride, at the far end of the passage near the wall. The figure simply ceased moving. It stood completely still, facing the concrete. Vincent leaned closer to his screen. The figure's posture was not tense. It was not cowering or pressing against the wall or doing anything that suggested distress. It was standing the way a person stands when they are waiting for something. Weight evenly distributed, head level, hands at the sides. It stood like that for the rest of the recording, through the remainder of his shift, through the arrival of the morning cleaning crew at 5:15, audible on the lobby camera, though they never went below ground level, through the timestamp ticking from 3:28 all the way to 6 o'clock when the recording ended. 2 hours and 32 minutes of standing still, facing a wall, except for the shadow. Vincent almost missed it. He was tired by then, his eyes dry from 6 straight hours of watching screens in a dark kitchen. And he nearly stopped the recording at 5:30 when it became clear nothing else was going to happen. But he let it run, and at some point in the final 40 minutes, he noticed that the shadow cast by the figure on the corridor floor, that correct, proper, physically accurate shadow he had observed the night before, had shifted, not by much, a few degrees, the way a shadow shifts when a light source changes angle slightly, or when the object casting it moves just enough to register. But the fluorescent lights in the basement corridor were fixed. They did not change angle, and the figure had not moved. Vincent watched the shadow very carefully for the last 30 minutes of the recording. It shifted 3 more times, small movements, each one. The figure that cast it remained completely motionless throughout, facing the wall, standing with that patient, even weight. The shadow moved on its own. He closed the laptop. He sat in his kitchen in his coat. Outside, the city had fully woken up. He could hear a bus on the street below, the distant clatter of a morning market, a child's voice somewhere close. Ordinary sounds from an ordinary city going about its business in the daylight. He opened the laptop again. He wrote his incident report in the same neat block characters he used in his logbook. He described what he had observed. He attached the timestamps. He used plain, careful language and made no conclusions. He submitted it to his supervisor's inbox at 11:15, then sat back and looked at the USB drive still plugged into the side of his laptop. After a moment, he made a second copy. His supervisor's name was John Y. Kyung, and he had managed the building for 6 years without ever appearing particularly interested in it. He was a practical man. He dealt with lift complaints, coordinated the cleaning contracts, processed the security logs at the end of each month without reading them closely. When Vincent's incident report landed in his inbox, John read it once, called Vincent into his office 2 days later, and sat across the desk from him with the expression of someone who has been handed a problem they have already decided not to have. He had a laptop open. The basement footage was playing on the screen. The copy from the building's own system, not Vincent's personal copy. John watched the figure walk for about 30 seconds. Then he closed the laptop. "Camera fault," he said. Vincent looked at him. "The shadow moves independently. You can see it in the last 2 hours of the... I'll have maintenance look at it." Chan picked up a pen and wrote something on a notepad. Whatever he wrote quickly. The way people write things they do not intend to revisit. "I'll log it as an equipment fault and submit the tape for review. You don't need to do anything further." Vincent went home. He sat in his car in the car park of his building for several minutes before going upstairs. He was not angry. He was not particularly surprised. What he felt, sitting in the car with the engine off and the February cold settling around him, was a very quiet and very specific kind of certainty that something had happened and that he was now the only person responsible for finding out what it was. He started with what the building was before it was a building. Hoi Fung Commercial Tower had been completed in 1997. That much was in the public record. Planning documents available through the land registry. The developer's name. The original architects. The build timeline. Standard commercial construction of the mid-90s. Nothing that stood out. But the site itself was older, and the site had a previous owner, and that previous owner had a name that appeared in a different kind of record altogether. It took Vincent 4 days of searching. Evenings mostly, sitting at his kitchen table between shifts, to find the right thread, a colonial-era property index, partially digitized, cross-referenced against a list of wartime land use records that a university archive had uploaded incompletely and without indexing. He almost missed it. The reference was a single line in a ledger transcription. The site at the Kowloon address had been requisitioned in December 1941, 2 weeks after the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong began, and reclassified as a holding facility for the duration of the occupation. He read that line several times. He wrote it in his logbook in the same neat block characters he used for everything else. The building management office kept its oldest files in a room on the second floor that had originally been a storage space and still functioned as one. Metal shelving, cardboard boxes with years written on their sides in marker, a smell of old paper, and the particular dustiness of things that have not been disturbed in a long time. Vincent had accessed the room before. Once, looking for an old electrical diagram during a maintenance question 2 years prior. He knew the filing system, such as it was. He knew that the boxes predating 2001 were under the previous management company's name and had never been properly transferred or reorganized when Hoi Fung's current operators took over. He went in on a Thursday afternoon, during the quiet hours after lunch, when Chan was in a meeting and the office assistant was at her desk with her headphones in. He told no one he was going. He was not sure this was the right decision. He went anyway. It took him 40 minutes to find the right box. It was labeled with the previous company name and the year range 1997 to 2003, the first years of the tower's operation, when the original handover documents from the developer had been filed and mostly forgotten. Inside, beneath a stack of contractor invoices and lift maintenance reports, was a rolled paper document secured with a rubber band that had long since dried out and snapped. He unrolled it carefully on the empty shelf beside him. It was a floor plan, not the current one. The dimensions were slightly different, and the labeling was in a combination of English and older traditional characters. He had to read slowly. It was dated 1944. He found the basement level. He found the service corridor. He traced its length with his finger and stopped at the far end, the end where the figure always appeared, the end with the blank concrete wall that led nowhere. In the 1944 plan, that wall was a doorway. It was labeled in small printed characters. He bent closer to read them. The label described a room beyond the doorway, a small room, 2 meters by 3, that did not appear on any floor plan he had ever seen for this building. A room that, as far as the current structure was concerned, did not exist. He rolled the document back up carefully and tucked it under his arm. He returned to the building after midnight. On a night he was not scheduled to work. He told himself he was simply checking something. He used his access card at the service entrance and took the stairs to the basement level and walked the corridor alone with a flashlight. The fluorescent strips were off. The emergency lighting cast a low amber glow along the floor. He walked the full length of the passage and stopped at the far wall. The concrete end, the blank end, the end the figure always walked toward. He put his flashlight in his left hand. He pressed his right palm flat against the wall. The surface was smooth, cold. He moved his hand slowly across it, covering as much area as he could reach. Near the center, he found what he was looking for. Not by sight, because the texture was nearly identical, but by the faintest difference in temperature. A rectangle, roughly 1 meter wide and 2 meters tall, where the wall was very slightly less cold than the concrete surrounding it. A section that held just a fraction less of the winter chill. Newer material, laid over older material. A filled-in space where a doorway had been. Vincent stood in the dark corridor, with his hand flat against the plaster, and did not move for a long time. Above him, the city went on. Traffic and voices, and the ordinary noise of Kowloon at 1 in the morning, pressing down through the concrete floors above his head. He thought about what had been done in this building during the years between 1941 and 1945. He thought about the room beyond the wall. He thought about the figure walking toward it, night after night, at the same steady pace, without hesitation or hurry, as if it knew exactly where it was going, as if it had been going there for a very long time. He took his hand off the wall. He walked back down the corridor, up the stairs, and out into the cold air of the street. He sat in his car for a while. Then he drove home and made tea he didn't drink and sat at his kitchen table until morning, with his logbook open in front of him. He did not write anything down. Not yet. He was not ready to make it that permanent. The second appearance was on a Thursday, 11 days after the first. Vincent had returned to his normal shifts by then, sitting at his station each night with his tea and his logbook, cycling through the 18 cameras the same way he always had. He told himself he had processed what he saw, that he had filed it somewhere reasonable inside himself, and moved on. He told himself this with some conviction for about a week, and then, on that Thursday night, at 2:19, screen 4 lit up with movement, and his hand went still over his logbook before he had even consciously registered what he was looking at. The figure, the same corridor, the same walk. He noted the time, the date, and the temperature. 6 degrees Celsius, according to the weather display he kept open on the small secondary screen in the corner of his station. He noted these things in his private logbook, the one he had started keeping, separate from the official record, after the second copy of the USB drive. He wrote them in the same neat block characters he used for everything. He watched the figure walk for 11 minutes before it stopped at the wall end and became still. He did not rewind the tape this time. He watched it live. Over the following 23 nights, the figure appeared 7 more times. Vincent logged every one: date, start time, duration, temperature. He constructed a small table in the back pages of his private logbook. Columns for each variable, rows for each appearance, the kind of organized record keeping that had always steadied him when other things felt uncertain. It was the same instinct that had made him good at this job for 11 years. When something is unclear, document it. When something is frightening, measure it. Measurement creates distance. Distance makes things manageable. The temperature pattern emerged on the 5th entry. He almost missed it because 3 of the appearances had occurred on nights that were cold, but not identically cold, and he had been looking for an exact number rather than a threshold. But when he drew a line under 12 degrees on his table and looked at the column again, it was clean. Every single appearance fell below that line. The 9 nights, the figure had not shown up. The temperature had been 12 degrees or above. He sat with that for a long time. He did not know what it meant. He was not sure it meant anything at all. Correlation was not the same as cause, and he was careful enough with evidence to know that. But it was a pattern, and patterns, in his experience, came from somewhere. What the pattern could not explain was what it was doing to him. He had stopped eating full meals sometime in the 3rd week. Not deliberately, he simply forgot, or found that by the time he remembered, he was no longer hungry. His daughter called on a Sunday evening, and he let it ring through to voicemail, and then sat looking at her name on the screen for several minutes before putting the phone face down on the table. He told himself he would call her back. He did not call her back. He began arriving at work 30 minutes early, then an hour. He told himself it was about monitoring, that arriving early gave him more time to observe the baseline before the significant hours began. This was true enough that he could believe it. But there was something underneath that truth he did not examine closely, that sitting at home in his flat in the hours before a shift had become difficult, that the stillness of his own kitchen felt wrong in a way he had no language for, that it was easier to be at the station, in front of the screens, watching. At least there he was doing something. At least there the waiting had a purpose. The colleague's name was Yuan Siu Lan. She worked the early morning overlap, arriving at 5:30 to relieve whatever guard had done the night shift. And over the years, she and Vincent had developed the easy, minimal friendship of people who share a space but rarely share the same hours. She brought her own tea. She kept her own counsel. He respected that about her. She found him one morning in the 4th week, sitting at his station 40 minutes past the end of his shift, still watching the screens. She set her bag down without comment and poured her tea, and then stood beside him for a moment, looking at the monitors. "You look terrible," she said, not unkindly. "I'm fine." She pulled the spare chair from the corner, the one that was never used because it had a leg that caught on the floor mat, and sat beside him. She looked at his private logbook, open on the desk. She did not ask about it. "Something happened," she said. It was not a question. Vincent looked at the screens for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and took out the second USB drive, the copy he had made and kept and never shown anyone, and plugged it into his laptop without speaking. He opened the basement footage. He skipped to 2:41 on the first night. Yuan watched the figure appear. She watched it walk. She watched it reach the wall and pass through it. She did not say anything. He let the footage run to 3:28, to the point where the figure stopped and stood still facing the concrete. He fast-forwarded to the section with the shadow. He let her watch the shadow move 3 times on its own. She was quiet for a long moment after he closed the laptop. "How many times has it appeared?" she asked. 8. Always below 12 degrees. She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are taking something seriously and not yet sure what to do with it. Then she looked at him directly. "What are you going to do about it?" Vincent opened his mouth to answer. He had been thinking about this question for 4 weeks, not consciously, not in words, but in the way you think about something you are not ready to face directly, circling it from a distance, keeping it in the corner of your vision. He had assumed that when the moment came to answer it, he would have something reasonable to say, a plan, a next step, the kind of clear, measured response he had always been able to produce when problems required them. But sitting in the blue light of 6 monitors, with Yuan watching him and the logbook open in front of him, and 8 recorded appearances logged in neat block characters, what came to him instead was something else entirely. Something he had been refusing to look at since the 3rd or 4th time he had watched the footage. Something that had been sitting at the back of his mind in the same way the figure stood at the end of the corridor, patient, still, waiting to be acknowledged. He knew the walk. He had known it for weeks, and he had not let himself say so, even privately, even in his own thoughts, because saying it would make it something he had to account for, something he had to explain. But sitting there with Yuan's question hanging in the air between them, He felt the recognition settle through him, the way cold settles into a room when a window has been left open, gradually, completely, and without mercy. The pace, the slight forward lean, the way the weight shifted from foot to foot with that particular economy of movement. Not brisk, but efficient. The walk of someone who moved through the world without wasting anything on it. He had watched that walk cross every room of his childhood home for the first 18 years of his life. He did not answer Yuen's question. He unplugged the USB drive and put it back in his pocket and stood up from his chair. He said good morning to her in the normal way and collected his logbook and his thermos and walked out through the lobby into the cold February street. He sat in his car for a long time before he could make himself drive. He called his daughter on a Saturday morning, not to explain anything, just to hear her voice. She answered on the second ring, which meant she had been waiting for him to call without saying so. That was very like her. She had her mother's patience and Vincent suspected. Rather more of his stubbornness than she would ever admit to. They talked for 20 minutes about ordinary things, her work, a film she had seen, the price of vegetables at the wet market near her flat. He listened more than he spoke. At the end, she said she would come for dinner next week, and he said yes, come Sunday. And she said she would bring the soup he liked, and he said that would be good. After he hung up, he sat quietly for a while. Then he called her back and asked if she could come sooner. That Sunday, and could she bring her drawings, her architectural plans, her reference materials, whatever she had that dealt with load-bearing structures and post-war building techniques in Kowloon. He told her he had something he needed her to look at. She asked what kind of something. He said he would explain when she arrived. She came the following afternoon with a canvas bag over one shoulder and the careful, assessing expression she had worn since childhood whenever she suspected she was walking into a situation her father had already decided the outcome of. "Show me," she said, before he had finished making tea. He drove her to the building on a Sunday, when the offices above were empty and the lobby had only one guard on duty, a young man named Patrick who knew Vincent and waved them through without question. They took the stairs to the basement. Vincent went first, the way he always did in that corridor now, out of a habit he had developed without noticing it. She walked into the corridor behind him with her canvas bag and her phone held up for light and said nothing for the first 30 seconds. She walked the full length of the passage slowly, running her hand along the right side wall the way she had been trained to do, reading the surface rather than just seeing it. She stopped at the far end, at the wall. She put both palms flat against it and stood there for a moment. Then she stepped back and looked at the corners where the wall met the ceiling, and then at the floor where it met the ground. She crouched down and pressed her thumb against the skirting. "Who authorized the infill?" she asked. Her voice was level, professional. "I don't know," Vincent said. "I don't think anyone currently associated with the building does either." She stood up. She looked at the wall for another moment, with the expression she got when she was calculating something she hadn't been asked to calculate yet. "This is post-war," she said. "The material behind the plaster is original. You can see where the concrete aggregate changes at the edges. But what's in front of it is much newer. 1980s at the earliest, maybe later." She paused. "Someone filled this in deliberately. This wasn't a structural modification. There's no reason to infill a doorway in a basement service corridor unless you're trying to close off access to something. Vincent took the rolled floor plan from his jacket. He had been carrying it with him for 2 weeks, folded carefully inside a plastic sleeve, and held it out to her. She unrolled it and looked at it for a long time without speaking. "There's a room," she said finally. "Yes." "Behind this wall?" "Yes." She rolled the plan back up and handed it to him and looked at the wall again. Something had shifted in her expression. The professional assessment still there, but something else behind it now. The thing that comes when you understand not just what a structure is, but what it was used for. "We should file for a structural inspection," she said quietly. "I know. Formally, through the building management. It needs to go through the right channels or nothing will happen." She paused. "It might not happen anyway. I know that too." She looked at him then, not at the wall, not at the floor plan, but at him. She had her mother's eyes, and she had always been able to use them the same way her mother had, to look at Vincent in a manner that suggested she could see somewhat further into him than he was comfortable with. "How long have you been carrying this?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "Since February," he said. And then, after a moment, "Longer, probably. I just didn't know it until February." She took his arm, and they walked back down the corridor, together and up the stairs, and out into the grey Sunday afternoon. The structural inspection request was filed the following week. The contractor, a firm his daughter had worked with before and trusted, came in on a Wednesday morning when the building was quiet. Vincent was not there for it. He heard the results from his daughter by phone that evening. Behind the infilled wall, the contractor had found a sealed room, 2 meters by 3. As the 1944 floor plan had indicated, the walls were the original wartime concrete. The floor was bare. There was a single rusted iron bracket fixed to the floor near the center of the room, the kind used to secure heavy furniture or structural fixtures or other things. The contractor had photographed everything and submitted the findings to the building management office and recommended that the relevant historical authorities be notified. Vincent's daughter told him all of this in a steady voice. When she finished, there was a short silence. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes," he said, and then, "I don't know. Come for dinner Sunday. I'll make the soup." "Yes," he said. "I will." He submitted his resignation that evening. He wrote it in the same neat block characters he used for everything. Addressed to Chon Wai-kyung, 2 weeks' notice. No explanation given. He sat at his kitchen table for a long time after he sent it. He felt something he had no clean word for. Not relief exactly, and not grief exactly, but something that occupied the same space as both of them at once. His last shift was on a Tuesday in March. The city was slightly warmer by then, 13 degrees, which meant Screen 4 would almost certainly be empty through the night. He sat at his station in the usual way. Tea poured, logbook open, 18 cameras cycling through their feeds. He wrote the date and the time and the weather in his official log and drew the line under the header the same way he always had. The night passed without incident. The building settled around him in its familiar way. The clicking elevator, the 14th floor door that never fully latched, all the small reliable sounds of a place he had known for 11 years. He did his rounds at 2 o'clock and at 4, and found everything exactly as it should be. The basement corridor was empty. The fluorescent lights hummed their slightly uneven hum. The second tube from the left was still a fraction dimmer than the rest. At 5:30, he heard Yuan arrive through the service entrance. She came to the station and set her bag down and looked at the empty desk beside his, where the spare chair still sat, with its leg that caught on the floor mat. "Last night," she said. "Last night," he agreed. She poured her tea and stood beside him for a moment, looking at the screens. Neither of them said anything else. There was nothing else that needed saying. Before he left, Vincent poured a second cup from his thermos. He set it on the desk beside his own, facing the monitors, the steam rising gently in the blue light of the screens. He sat with it there for the remaining 20 minutes of his shift. Just the two cups, the quiet building, and whatever else shared the space with him in the way that some things do, not loudly, not visibly, but present in the particular manner of things that have nowhere else to be. At 6 o'clock, he stood up. He closed his logbook. He collected his thermos. The second cup was half empty. He did not look back at it. He already knew what it meant. He had known, in some form, since the first night he watched that corridor and recognized something in the way a figure moved through a space it could not leave. Patient and unhurried, and bound to a route it had been walking for longer than either of them had words for, he walked out through the lobby into the March morning. The air was cool and clear, and the city was already moving around him, loud and ordinary, and completely indifferent to everything that lay beneath it. He took the long way home. If this story stayed with you, I think it was meant to. New stories from across Asia, every week, right here. I'm Haunted East. Subscribe if you want to keep listening.